What we thought we knew about the Shroud of Turin may not be the full story. For years, many people believed the mystery had already been solved. But recently, actor and filmmaker Mel Gibson stepped into the conversation and made a claim that has left many people stunned. During his appearance on the Joe Rogan Podcast, Gibson suggested that the public may have been misled about the real evidence surrounding this mysterious cloth. His statements have reignited debate and even caused some skeptics to reconsider their views about the shroud's authenticity. So what exactly did Mel Gibson reveal that has people so shocked and curious? And is there any real credibility behind his claims? Before we dive in, make sure to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's explore this mystery together. In early 2025, something unexpected happened during a conversation on the Joe Rogan Experience. What began as a wide-ranging discussion about history, faith, and culture eventually turned toward one of the most controversial religious artifacts in the world, the Shroud of Turin. As the topic came up, Mel Gibson did not treat the shroud as a simple historical curiosity. Instead, he spoke about it with a level of conviction that immediately caught people's attention. During the discussion, Gibson pointed to several aspects of the shroud that he believes are rarely mentioned when the artifact is discussed publicly. He talked about the unusual properties of the image, the scientific investigations that studied the cloth, and the ongoing debate surrounding its authenticity. Then, he made a statement that quickly spread across the internet. According to Gibson, the shroud has been dismissed far too quickly. In his words, "They're lying to you about the shroud." That sentence alone was enough to reignite a controversy many believed had already been settled decades ago. For years, the dominant narrative surrounding the shroud focused on the carbon dating test performed in 1988. That test appeared to place the cloth in the medieval period, and for many people, it seemed like definitive proof that the artifact could not possibly date back to the time of Jesus. But Gibson argued that the story did not end there. He suggested that several scientific findings about the shroud remain difficult to explain and deserve far more attention than they usually receive. According to Gibson, the image itself contains characteristics that scientists still struggle to reproduce, even with modern technology. And that raises an important question. If the shroud were simply a medieval creation, why does the image behave in ways that researchers still find difficult to explain? Now, whether one agrees with Gibson's interpretation or not, his comments achieved something remarkable. They pushed the Shroud of Turin back into global discussion and encouraged people to take another look at evidence that has been debated for centuries. And once you begin examining the details surrounding the cloth, the story quickly becomes far more complex than many people realize. Because before we can understand why the shroud remains so controversial, we first need to look closely at what actually appears on the cloth itself. Inside the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, a long piece of linen cloth is carefully preserved under controlled conditions. To someone seeing it for the first time, it may appear surprisingly ordinary. The fabric looks aged, slightly yellowed, and worn by time. But when observers look closely, a faint image begins to emerge across the surface of the cloth. The image shows the outline of a human figure. What makes it unusual is that the cloth appears to display two views of the same body. One image shows the front of the man, and the other shows the back, as if the fabric had once been wrapped completely around a body lying inside it. The figure appears tall, with long hair and a beard, and the body shows clear signs of severe physical trauma. Across the back of the figure are dozens of small wounds, arranged in patterns that resemble injuries caused by whipping. There are also marks around the head, suggesting a series of punctures. On the chest, near the ribs, a large wound is visible. Even the arms and feet appear to show injuries consistent with nails passing through them. Taken together, these details resemble something very specific: a Roman crucifixion. Historians know that Roman executions often involved brutal flogging before the victim was nailed to a cross. The patterns of wounds on the cloth seem consistent with that type of punishment. The marks across the back resemble the kind of injuries that could be produced by a Roman whip, known as a flagrum, which contained multiple leather strands with metal or bone tips. Now here is where the story becomes even more interesting. In medieval art, crucifixion scenes almost always show nails driven through the palms of the hands. But on the shroud, the wounds appear to be located in the wrists instead. Modern medical studies of crucifixion have shown that nails placed in the palms would not support the weight of a body. The wrists, however, could. This detail has raised an intriguing question among researchers. If the shroud were created by a medieval artist, how would that artist know that the wrists, not the palms, were the more accurate location for crucifixion nails? And that is exactly the type of detail that Mel Gibson pointed to when discussing the shroud. According to Gibson, the physical details visible on the cloth make the artifact far more difficult to dismiss than many critics suggest. In his view, the wounds appear remarkably consistent with the historical descriptions of crucifixion. But the injuries on the cloth are only part of the mystery. Because the more closely scientists studied the shroud, the more they realized something else about the image itself. It doesn't behave like an ordinary painting or drawing. In fact, the image becomes clearer the farther away you stand from it, almost like a photographic effect. And that strange property would eventually lead to one of the most shocking discoveries in the entire history of the shroud. In 1898, a moment occurred that completely transformed the investigation of the Shroud of Turin. An Italian lawyer and amateur photographer named Secondo Pia was granted permission to photograph the cloth. At the time, photography was still a relatively new technology, and no one expected the images to reveal anything particularly unusual. The shroud itself had already been studied for centuries, and most observers believed they understood what they were looking at. But when Pia returned to his darkroom to develop the glass photographic plates, something unexpected appeared. As the negative image slowly formed, the faint figure on the cloth suddenly became far clearer. Details that were barely visible on the shroud itself appeared sharply in the photograph. The face of the man became distinct. The beard, the nose, the shape of the eyes, even some of the wounds were suddenly much easier to see. Pia reportedly stared at the plate in disbelief. What he had just discovered was extraordinary. The image on the shroud behaves like a photographic negative. When the colors are reversed, the faint shapes on the cloth transform into a much more realistic human image. Now consider how strange that is. Photography did not exist in medieval Europe. Yet the cloth appears to contain an image that only becomes fully visible when processed as a photographic negative. If the shroud had truly been created in the Middle Ages, whoever made it would somehow have needed to produce an image that behaves like a negative photograph, centuries before anyone even understood how photography worked. This discovery instantly changed how researchers approached the artifact. For many scientists, the shroud was no longer simply a religious relic. It had become a scientific puzzle. How could an image with properties similar to a photographic negative exist on an ancient piece of linen? Mel Gibson pointed to this very discovery when discussing the shroud during his appearance on the Joe Rogan Podcast. According to Gibson, findings like this are one reason he believes the artifact cannot be dismissed as easily as some critics claim. In the conversation, he emphasized that the image contains characteristics that remain difficult to explain even with modern technology. But the mystery did not end with the photographic negative. As researchers continued studying images of the shroud, they noticed another strange feature hidden within the picture. When the brightness levels of the image were analyzed using specialized imaging equipment, scientists discovered that the intensity of the image seemed to correspond with the distance between the cloth and the body that may have been inside it. In other words, the image contains information that can be translated into three-dimensional form. When computers processed this data, they were able to generate a surprisingly accurate three-dimensional representation of the face and body visible on the cloth. Most ordinary photographs or paintings produce distorted results when analyzed this way. The shroud did not. Instead, the data behaved more like an imprint left by an actual human body. And that discovery raised a much bigger question. If the image wasn't painted, and if it somehow contains three-dimensional information, then what exactly created it in the first place? That question would eventually lead scientists to launch one of the most detailed investigations the shroud had ever faced. By the late 1970s, the mystery surrounding the Shroud of Turin had attracted the attention of scientists around the world. Researchers realized that if the cloth truly contained unusual properties, then it needed to be examined using modern scientific tools. That opportunity finally came in 1978, when an international team of researchers was granted limited access to study the shroud directly. The group became known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or simply STURP. This was not a small investigation. The team included physicists, chemists, engineers, imaging specialists, and medical experts. For 5 intense days inside the cathedral in Turin, the scientists worked almost non-stop, bringing in specialized equipment to analyze the cloth from multiple angles. During that time, they captured thousands of detailed photographs, used advanced microscopes, and performed numerous chemical and physical tests on the fibers of the linen. One of the most important questions they wanted to answer was straightforward. Was the image simply a painting? If the shroud had been created as a medieval forgery, then the image would almost certainly contain traces of pigments, dyes, or brushstrokes. But when researchers examined the fibers closely under powerful microscopes, they discovered something surprising. There was no evidence of paint. No pigments were found embedded in the fibers. There were no signs of brush marks. The image also did not behave like dye, because the discoloration did not soak through the threads of the fabric. Instead, scientists observed something very unusual. The image exists only on the outermost surface of the linen fibers. The threads themselves are not deeply colored. Only the extremely thin outer layer of the fibers appears slightly darkened. In fact, the coloration is so shallow that if the outer microscopic layer of the fibers were removed, the image would disappear completely. This kind of image formation does not match any known painting technique. Researchers also studied the dark stains visible across the cloth. Chemical analysis suggested that these stains were real blood, and further testing indicated that the blood was human. Medical experts who examined the wound patterns noticed something else that caught their attention. The injuries appeared consistent with Roman crucifixion practices. For example, the puncture wounds are located in the wrists rather than the palms, which aligns with what modern medical studies suggest about how crucifixions were actually carried out. The marks across the back also resemble injuries produced by a Roman whip with multiple strands. These observations made the artifact even more difficult to explain. Mel Gibson has pointed to discoveries like these as one reason he believes the shroud should not be dismissed too quickly. During his discussion about the cloth, he emphasized that the scientific findings raised questions that still remain unanswered. But despite all the data collected during the STURP investigation, the researchers reached a surprising conclusion. They were able to determine what the image was not. It was not paint. It was not dye. It was not created by any obvious artistic method. But the one question everyone wanted answered remained unresolved. If the image wasn't painted, then how did it appear on the cloth at all? By the late 1980s, many researchers believed the mystery of the Shroud of Turin could finally be solved using one powerful scientific method: radiocarbon dating. This technique measures the decay of carbon-14 in organic materials and allows scientists to estimate how old an object is. If applied to the shroud, it could potentially determine when the cloth was made. In 1988, the Catholic Church agreed to allow a small piece of the linen to be removed for testing. The sample was carefully divided and sent to 3 respected laboratories: Oxford University, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. Each laboratory performed its own analysis independently using the same carbon dating method. When the results were published, the reaction was immediate. All 3 laboratories reported nearly identical conclusions. According to the tests, the cloth dated to somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD. That placed the origin of the shroud firmly in the medieval period, more than 1,000 years after the time of Jesus. Within days, newspapers across the world began reporting the same message. The mystery was over. If the cloth was medieval, then it could not possibly be the burial shroud described in the Gospels. For many scientists and historians, the carbon dating result seemed decisive. The shroud was now widely described as a remarkable but ultimately medieval relic. For a time, that conclusion dominated public discussion. But as the excitement around the test settled, some researchers began looking more closely at the details of the experiment. Their questions were not about the reliability of carbon dating itself. Instead, they focused on something very specific: where the sample had been taken from. The piece of linen used for testing came from one corner of the shroud. Over the centuries, that particular area had experienced far more handling than the rest of the cloth. During public exhibitions, the shroud was often lifted and held from that corner while it was displayed to pilgrims. As a result, the fibers there had been exposed to centuries of touching, oils from human hands, candle smoke, and environmental contamination. But another historical event complicated things even further. In 1532, a fire broke out in the chapel where the shroud was stored. The intense heat damaged the cloth, leaving burn marks and holes in several places. Later, nuns carefully repaired sections of the fabric by weaving additional threads into the damaged areas. Some historians believe that the corner used for the carbon dating test may contain threads from those later repairs. And this is exactly the issue Mel Gibson raised during his discussion of the shroud. Speaking about the test, Gibson argued that the dating result may not represent the entire cloth. In his view, the test has often been presented as the final answer, even though the possibility of contamination or repair threads has never been completely ruled out. In other words, the result that convinced the world the mystery was solved might not be as simple as it first appeared. And once researchers began revisiting the evidence, several other clues started drawing attention again. Clues that some believe point far beyond medieval Europe. Even after the carbon dating results were announced, the debate surrounding the Shroud of Turin did not disappear. In fact, over time, several researchers began pointing to other pieces of evidence that seemed difficult to reconcile with a simple medieval origin. One of the most discussed areas involves pollen grains discovered on the cloth. During earlier examinations of the shroud, A Swiss criminologist named Max Frey collected microscopic particles from the fabric. Among those particles were dozens of pollen grains from different plant species. When these samples were later studied, researchers identified pollen from plants native to the Middle East, including species that grow in the region around Jerusalem. Now, pollen evidence alone cannot prove where the cloth originated. Pollen can travel long distances through wind or human contact. But the presence of multiple plant species from the same region raised an interesting possibility: that the cloth may have spent time in the Middle East before appearing in Europe. And that possibility aligns with certain historical theories about the shroud's journey through the ancient world. Another detail that has attracted attention involves the weaving pattern of the linen itself. Textile experts who examined the cloth noticed that it uses a distinctive 3-to-1 herringbone weave. This is not a simple pattern commonly found in many medieval fabrics. While it did exist in later periods, similar weaving styles have also been identified in ancient textiles from the Eastern Mediterranean region. Some researchers argue that this weaving pattern may be consistent with textile production methods that existed in the 1st century. Mel Gibson mentioned evidence like this when discussing the shroud publicly. According to Gibson, certain clues that might suggest an older origin often receive far less attention than the carbon dating result. His argument is not that these clues prove the shroud is authentic, but that they raise questions that deserve further examination. Medical analysis of the image has also added to the discussion. Forensic specialists studying the wounds visible on the cloth have noted that the injuries appear consistent with known Roman crucifixion practices. The marks across the back resemble injuries from a Roman scourging whip, while the wound in the side matches the type of spear injury described in historical accounts of crucifixions. One detail researchers often point out is the position of the nail wounds. The marks appear to be located near the wrists rather than the palms. As modern studies have shown, nails placed in the palms would likely tear through the flesh under the weight of a body. The wrists, however, provide stronger structural support. For some investigators, details like these make the image surprisingly realistic. But even if the cloth were ancient, another mystery still remains, because none of these clues explain how the image itself formed on the linen. And that question may be the most puzzling part of the entire shroud story. Even after decades of research, one question about the Shroud of Turin continues to puzzle scientists more than any other. How did the image actually form on the cloth? Researchers have spent years attempting to recreate the image using known techniques. Experiments have tested a wide range of possibilities, including painting, chemical reactions, heat scorching, and even early photographic methods. Each attempt tried to reproduce the same faint human figure that appears on the shroud, but none of them have successfully recreated the same characteristics. One of the most unusual features of the shroud image is how superficial it is. The discoloration appears only on the very outer surface of the linen fibers. The threads themselves are not fully colored, and the image does not penetrate deep into the fabric. If the image had been produced by paint or liquid dye, scientists would expect the color to soak deeper into the threads. Instead, the image seems to exist only on the microscopic tips of the fibers. This property alone makes it extremely difficult to reproduce using conventional artistic techniques. Another surprising discovery emerged when researchers analyzed high-resolution images of the cloth using computer imaging systems. Scientists found that the brightness levels within the image correspond to the distance between the cloth and the body that may have been inside it. In other words, the image contains three-dimensional information. When this data is processed by computers, it can generate a surprisingly realistic three-dimensional model of a human face and body. Most ordinary paintings or photographs produce distorted results when analyzed this way. But the shroud behaves differently. The data appears to represent the contours of an actual human form. This discovery led some researchers to explore a more unusual idea. A few scientists have proposed what is sometimes called the radiation hypothesis. According to this theory, a sudden burst of energy might have interacted with the cloth, causing the outer fibers to discolor in a pattern that produced the image. Various forms of energy have been suggested, including ultraviolet radiation or other physical processes that are not yet fully understood. However, no experiment has successfully reproduced the image using these methods either. Mel Gibson briefly referred to this mystery when discussing the shroud. In the podcast conversation, he suggested that the amount of energy required to create such an imprint would be extraordinary, far beyond what ordinary physical processes could easily produce. For Gibson and many believers, this raises the possibility that the image might be connected to something far more unusual. Of course, science has not confirmed that interpretation, but here is the intriguing part. After decades of investigation, researchers can say with confidence what the image is not. It is not paint. It is not dye. It is not a traditional photograph. And yet, the process that created the image remains unknown. Which leaves one final question. If none of the known explanations fully account for the shroud, then what actually produced the image in the first place? After centuries of investigation, the Shroud of Turin remains one of the most debated artifacts in human history. Scientists have examined the cloth using some of the most advanced tools available. Historians have traced its recorded appearance through medieval Europe. Forensic experts have studied the wounds visible in the image. And yet, despite all of this research, the mystery is still not fully resolved. On one side of the debate, many researchers continue to point to the carbon dating results from 1988, which suggested the cloth originated in the Middle Ages. For them, that evidence strongly supports the idea that the shroud is a remarkable but ultimately medieval artifact. On the other side, there are still questions that remain unanswered. The image does not behave like a painting. It contains three-dimensional information that scientists cannot easily explain. The wounds on the body appear consistent with Roman crucifixion. And even today, no experiment has successfully recreated an image with the same properties found on the shroud. This is exactly why the discussion continues. Mel Gibson's comments simply brought new attention to a mystery that has fascinated people for generations. When he said, "They're lying to you about the shroud," he was expressing his belief that the story surrounding the cloth may not be as settled as many people think. Whether one agrees with him or not, his statement encouraged many people to take a closer look at the evidence and ask new questions. And perhaps that is what makes the shroud so compelling. It sits at the intersection of history, science, and faith. For some people, it may represent a possible connection to one of the most significant events described in the Gospels. For others, it remains a fascinating historical puzzle waiting for a scientific explanation. But either way, the Shroud of Turin continues to challenge our understanding. So now we want to hear from you. What do you think? Do you believe the Shroud of Turin could truly be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ? Or do you think it is simply an extraordinary artifact from the medieval world? If you found this story interesting, don't forget to like the video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more videos exploring mysteries like this. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.
Creating this video about the Shroud of Turin has been an incredible journey. It's more than just a historical artifact. It's a profound mystery that challenges our understanding of faith and science. Mel Gibson's perspective. Whether you agree with him or not, reignite a crucial conversations, forcing us to look beyond simplistic answer. We found that every clue we unearthed, from the unique negative image to the forensic details of crucifixion, only adds another layer of intrigue, complicating the story far beyond that many assume. It truly shows that some mysteries are deep, demanding we keep questioning. What do you think? Is it the ultimate symbol of fate or history's greatest enigma? Make sure to share your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe for more deep dives into the unknown.